Thanks for joining us this morning for a discussion of China and U.S. policy. You know, one of the enduring questions in U.S. policy towards China is where to put the needle on the balance between cooperation and confrontation. And China has kind of moved that needle in its own policy more in the direction of confrontation, especially under the current leader, who's committed to remaking the regional security order in ways favorable to China's interests, and has downplayed cooperation. And of course, the Trump administration's national security strategy makes somewhat the same choice, putting economic interests at the top of the agenda, a more confrontational approach on economic interests, as you all know, and pushing also in the political and security domains, basically having moved the dial more towards confrontation while also seeking new forms of cooperation on North Korea, for example, and some other challenges. This reflects in part a reading of where China is in its view of the global order, having moved in part from a beneficiary and quiet acceptor of that order to more of a challenger. But one of the key uncertainties in this is whether President Xi has gone as far as President Putin in his views of the existing world order. President Putin has said very clearly, you may remember the photograph from a speech he gave at the Valdai Club in Russia in 2014. The banner said, new rules or no rules. A pretty clear declaration of opposition to the existing rules-based international order. And it's unclear whether President Xi is entirely of the view that we should be about new rules or no rules, or whether there's some more room for accommodation around some set of rules. This is a topic with deep historical roots in China's engagement with the larger world community over the last century. And we have the benefit today of an historian's thinking on this subject to bring an additional perspective and context. Our speaker, Dan, sorry, I always get the order of the hyphenated, Dan Kurtz Phelan, with us today. He's executive editor of the journal Foreign Affairs, hopefully well known to all of you. He has a new book, which is the topic of today's discussion, and I'll let you introduce your book. Please join me in welcoming Dan this morning.
Well, thank you so much, Brad and Ben, for having me at Livermore. I've been hearing about the work you all do for a long time, so it's very good to finally be here in person. I should say before I get into my book, which is in some ways a kind of forgotten origin story of the contemporary U.S.-China relationship, I should say that in my day job as executive editor of Foreign Affairs, I have the pleasure of being a dilettante and getting to skip around among lots of different topics. So I hope in the discussion and Q&A to hear from you all on a broader range of topics if they're on your mind, because what I get to do or have to do is feed the beast of the magazine and website with interesting stuff that people like you find credible and interesting. So to the extent that there are topics beyond what I address in the talk that you all think I should hear from you on, please by all means bring those up. Let me, before I get into the substance of this story, talk a bit about why I think history is something we should spend more time thinking about and looking at when addressing present-day policy challenges. The period that I write about, the years after World War II, is in some ways the most mythologized time in the history of American foreign policy. It's the moment when the global order we talk about now was created, when the kind of models of leadership and policy and strategy that we constantly refer back to really started to take shape. And it's some ways seen as a sort of golden age of American foreign policy making. It's the time when the wise men were making strategy at DOD and the State Department. It was this time when, in the way we remember it, these kind of giants walked the earth. Dean Acheson and Harry Truman and Jim Forrestal, all of them we look back on as these kind of gray mythic figures. And in some ways, the figure who is at the center of that more than any other is George Marshall, who is also the subject of my book. The origin of the book for me comes from my time serving in government in the State Department, in the Office of Policy Planning specifically, which I think is particularly subject to the burdens of history. It was an office that was created by George Marshall and George Kennan in 1947. Its very first task was creating the Marshall Plan. And when you work in policy planning, people refer back to that constantly. No matter what you're working on, people inevitably say, just do a Marshall Plan for that. If you're thinking about Southeast Asia, they say, why don't you come up with a Marshall Plan for Southeast Asia? If you're thinking about, the post-Arab Spring Middle East, there's an endless stream of Thomas Friedman columns calling on you to come up with a Marshall Plan for Tunisia or for Syria or whatever else. So in the policymaking process, there is this shadow of this very, very mythologized period in history when we came up with containment, when we created the kind of modern national security architecture, including Livermore was founded in early 50s. What was the so much of the infrastructure we work with today grows out of this moment. And in many ways, the story I tell in the book, the story of George Marshall's China mission, is a story that cuts against the mythology we tend to have that period. The way we think about it, this is the moment when America stepped up to global leadership, when it accepted the burdens of world power and created doctrines and models that allowed it to shape the earth and shape the course of the Cold War to its favor. But the story of Marshall's China mission cuts against that in the sense that it takes someone who is really the central figure of American ambition and strength and possibility in that period, and is a story of him showing restraint and kind of accepting what he couldn't do. And in that sense, it, I think, rebalances the story we tell about this period, a story that very much shapes the way we think about American strategy and foreign policy sense, but also, I think, sheds some light on the way Marshall thought about the work he was doing and the strategies he was shaping subsequently. So I'll come back around to some of those contemporary lessons, but first I'll get into the history a bit. I also want to make a case for using narrative to get at these questions. I wanted to write this book, though it has 100 pages of notes and I hope kind of withstands academic scrutiny, but I wanted to do it as a story. And in part that's because I wanted to sell books and people like to read stories, but I also thought that by trying to inhabit the moment with the characters of the book, you actually get a much better sense, a much more sophisticated sense of how they thought about strategy and how they thought about the constraints and challenges at the time. You get to see what they knew and what they didn't know, what they thought the trade-offs were. And I think a lot of our analysis of history tends to be much more deterministic and to leave out a lot of that choice, and things that look inevitable in retrospect obviously do not appear that way to people making policy at the time. So as we think about some of the big strategic questions now, whether it's how we deal with the new US-China competition or what great power competition means, I think going back and trying to think about this moment when policymakers faced a similar set of questions and came up with some strategies that were quite successful, others less so. How did they see those issues in real time? And the only way to do that is to be with them in the moment right after World War II, when they don't know how the world's going to play out. They don't know that the Cold War is coming. And it's easy to forget that when you go back and look at that history, knowing everything we know now. But I really wanted to try to write as if we did not know how it was going to turn out. Now, let me talk about a few elements of the story and give you a sense of the overview of this moment in history that I think bear some resonance or relevance to issues we address today, and then I'm happy to talk about a much broader range of questions that grow out of this. The first is at this moment, right after the end of World War II in the second half of 1945. In many ways like today, the problem of China and how China was going to develop really threatened to undermine the whole US vision of what the world order was supposed to look like. So during World War II, the idea that FDR and then Truman had is that there would be a great power peace following World War II. The big four powers would together make sure that there was not a return to the kind of terrible war that Americans had seen twice over the previous few decades with World War I and World War II. And the way that was supposed to work is that you would have the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China together serving as the world policemen. The allies of the war would together make sure that there was not a return to war in anyone's lifetime. Now, part of the problem was that, leaving aside US-Soviet competition, which is just starting to arise, one of these big four powers is China. And China does not really look like a modern great power at the time. It's much closer to a failed state. You have the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, which is in Chongqing, very, very tenuously reestablishing control over mainland China after it's been occupied by the Japanese for a decade, very brutally. You have a Soviet occupation in Manchuria in northeastern China with about 300,000 Soviet troops there. You have 100,000 or so American troops, which have in part been there during the war. Some of them have arrived after the war to help the nationalists reestablish control over the mainland. And then you have the communists led by Mao, based in Yan'an, which are challenging the nationalists for control. So Harry Truman, who's president at the time, looks at China and says, this is supposed to be one of the pillars of peace in the post-war world. But what I see instead is this failing state that not just threatens to become incredibly chaotic and not serve the role that it's supposed to in this new order, but also threatens to suck in the United States and the Soviets and bring this whole vision crashing down. So Truman in this moment looks to the figure that he sees as more commanding and more impressive than anyone else he's dealt with in his time as president so far, and that is George Marshall. Now, Marshall had spent the previous 6 years as Army Chief of Staff. He took over in that job the morning that Hitler invaded Poland. So he's had a pretty busy 6 years, and during that time has really built the modern American army. He's really more responsible than anyone else for creating modern American military power, taking what had been a pretty gentlemanly army before World War II and turning it into the most impressive fighting machine anyone had ever seen. And Marshall had, the day before he gets a call from Truman, retired. He'd spent 6 years in this job. He's about to turn 65 years old. His wife, Catherine, who's a very, very interesting and important figure in the story in many ways, has planned vacations for them. He's ready to call it quits. So he has a retirement ceremony at the Pentagon, which is a brand new building at the time, drives out to Leesburg, Virginia, where he and Catherine have their home, walks through the door ready to kind of leave everything behind, and in under an hour gets a phone call from Harry Truman. And Truman says to him, General, I'm really, really sorry to do this one day after you're retired, but I need one last little favor from you before you can go off and enjoy your retirement. I need you to go to China and take care of this little problem I have there. Just go broker a ceasefire in the civil war between the nationalists and communists, lay the groundwork for a Chinese democracy, and just make sure China does not become a problem for us. You can do this in 2 or 3 months. It's not going to take that long. You're such a commanding figure. You'll pull this off pretty quickly. And then you can go back and retire. Catherine, Marshall's wife, is furious, as you can imagine, because she's seen her husband work this very hard 6 years. But she knows that her husband can't say no to this request from the president. That's his sense of duty will not let him. And of course, rather than this being a 3-month mission, it becomes a 13-month mission. And rather than it marking the swan song in Marshall's career, it actually starts what may be the most important phase of it, when he becomes Secretary of State and is responsible for the Marshall Plan and many of the kind of early Cold War strategies that would kind of carry us forward for 70 years. He becomes Secretary of Defense after that. It's 6 years before he actually retires, which Catherine is not happy about. Now, the second point that I think is really relevant to policy issues today, policy questions today, is that when Marshall gets there in December 1945, what is really striking, in retrospect, it looks crazy to imagine that you could broker an end to this civil war and create a Chinese democracy and persuade the nationalists and communists to come together in a coalition government. That looks like a totally insane request, knowing everything we know now. But there is this moment in late 1945, early 1946, where Marshall seems to pull it off. Now, you need to remember that the Cold War is those tensions are starting to come to the surface, but people haven't really figured out what this post-war world looks like. There's the one world vision, the big four powers that had been really central to planning for the post-war during World War II, but there are growing fears about Soviet power, about communism in Asia and in Europe, and people are starting to think about what this world looks like. But in this moment, in late 1945 and early 1946, there still is this shred of hope that there will be cooperation, that a cooperative environment will be the really defining factor in the post-war landscape. And so Marshall gets to China in late 1945, and Stalin looks at the balance of forces there and says, you know what, Mao and the communists can't win. I'm going to tell Mao he has to cooperate. Marshall, as the representative of the Americans, is saying to the nationalists and to Chiang Kai-shek, you really need to negotiate with the communists. Marshall gets there, and sort of miraculously, within 6 weeks, he has a ceasefire agreement between the two parties. He has an agreement to merge the two armies into one national Chinese army for the first time in decades. he has even an agreement to start working towards a Chinese democracy. In this kind of extraordinary moment, he hands Chiang Kai-shek a draft Bill of Rights and says, this is going to be the basis for a new Chinese democracy. And Marshall says to him, this is just the dose of American medicine that you Chinese need, which he thinks the nationalists find funny. But of course, if you read Chiang Kai-shek's diary, he's fuming about the kind of imperious American attitude that he sees from Marshall. But in these months, as these agreements seem to come into place, you see this amazing array of figures on the American side and globally really think that this new China is coming to existence. This new democratic, peaceful, cooperative China is coming to be. And it feels a little bit like the run-up to the Iraq War, the early days of the Iraq War in some ways, where there is this just exuberant embrace of this new democracy. And Marshall, who's a pretty hard-headed guy who did not set this goal, he's acting on the instructions that Truman gave him, starts to lecture the Chinese about freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. He at one point has a volume of Benjamin Franklin's speeches translated, and you see him reading these speeches to Chinese communists, which looks kind of preposterous in retrospect, of course. He even at one point goes and talks to the director Frank Capra, who would direct It's a Wonderful Life most famously. Marshall goes to Capra and says, I want you to create a series of instructional videos for the Chinese to teach them how democracy works. The videos never get made because democracy has not come into existence, but Marshall at this moment really sees this new China coming to be. And it's not just Marshall. You see Stalin thinking that Marshall has managed to pull it off and telling Mao and the communists that they need to play along with what Marshall's telling them. You see Mao telling his followers that the new path of struggle is going to be political rather than military. You see a lot of figures in the US who later would become very ardent Cold Warriors and critics of Marshall during this period, saying that they're fully in agreement with Marshall's doing. That includes General Douglas MacArthur, who's in Japan at the time. It includes Henry Luce, the editor of Time magazine, who had become one of the leading figures of the China lobby, which is a part of the story I'll get to later. All of these people look at what's happening in China and say, this is the best path forward, and Marshall has managed to pull it off. So Marshall, after a couple months, thinks that he has managed to do exactly what Truman charged him with doing, and he goes on what is sort of a victory tour around China. He's not a triumphalist type of guy, but he thinks he's managed to create this new China. And so he goes and travels around to these places that have been at war for a couple of decades at that point, and announces that there is this new peace coming. And he's hailed as he's traveling around as a sort of god of peace, this ambassador of peace. And you see these enormous crowds greeting him wherever he goes. And in the culminating moment of this trip, he goes to Yan'an in northwest China, where the communists have been headquartered since the end of the Long March. And Marshall meets with Mao for spends 24 hours in Yan'an talking about the new China with the communists. And they talk about everything that Mao is going to learn when he goes and visits the United States. They talk about this kind of new future of friendship and peace, and this future of cooperation between the nationalists and communists. Now, in a kind of eerie historical coincidence, at this very moment that Marshall and Mao are sitting in Yan'an talking about the peaceful future, the communists are also watching very closely as Winston Churchill travels around the United States. And as many of you probably know, this is a moment when Churchill goes to Missouri and gives a speech about the Iron Curtain falling between the Western and communist world. So the communists see, on the one hand, Marshall telling them that there's this future of great power cooperation, that the nationalists and communists are going to work together to create this new China. On the other hand, they're watching Churchill in Missouri say, we're entering a very competitive, different kind of future, a much darker future. And they start to kind of weigh these two visions of the world and try to figure out which one is going to come to pass. And in time, they see that it's the Cold War vision. It's not the one world vision that they're really going to be contending with, and that changes the calculation for them. It's not just Churchill. You also see Stalin's famous Army Day speech in February of this year. You see George Kennan's long telegram, which is one of the first things that alerts a lot of people in Washington to the new Soviet posture. As all of these currents start to make their way into thinking in Moscow, in Yan'an, in national circles, and in Washington, both sides in China start to really change their calculations. At first, of course, they have their outside powers telling them they have to cooperate. Peace is the only option. Suddenly, they say we're entering a very, very different world, and that means that we will actually fight it out. We can fight it out. And they both have pretty good reason to think that the outside powers are going to support them. Mao starts to get a slightly different message from Stalin as tensions between Washington and Moscow start to grow. Chiang Kai-shek looks at Washington and says, I'm hearing about this Cold War thinking in Washington. It's not what I was hearing during World War II, and no matter what Marshall tells me, I'm going to be able to get support from Washington. Marshall's telling me that the only way I will get U.S. support is if I cooperate with the communists. That's not what it's going to be like in a year. And one additional amazing historical detail that is quite relevant in this discussion, Marshall, before he left, has a conversation in the Oval Office with Truman, where Marshall keeps asking Truman, what do I do if the nationalists don't cooperate? I'm supposed to go and tell Chiang Kai-shek that his only option is to negotiate with the communists, that we're not going to back him in a civil war, we're not going to back him in a fight till the end. What if they don't cooperate? Can I threaten to withdraw American support from the nationalists? And Truman keeps saying to Marshall, look, don't worry about it. You're such a commanding figure. You're so persuasive that you're going to pull it off. And Marshall says, no, I really want a plan B. I really want to understand what leverage I actually have. And Truman finally concedes to him in a private conversation in the White House that ultimately the Americans can never fully withdraw support from the nationalists. So Marshall knows that. He doesn't want to reveal that to the nationalists, of course, but he does know that. Now somehow that conversation gets leaked, that detail gets leaked, and makes its way in time back to the Chinese nationalists. And Chiang Kai-shek hears from his sources in Washington, Marshall might be telling you have to cooperate, but there's reason to think that no matter what he says, Truman's going to end up backing you. And that to him is a sign that he doesn't have to be quite as cooperative as he thought at the beginning. So both the communists and nationalists read the changing international landscape, the kind of changing international structures, and realize that instead of cooperating with Marshall, they can prepare to fight to the death. And that is the kind of second half of Marshall's mission. He's trying very, very desperately to put these agreements back together as they start to come apart. But both sides look at an international landscape that is very different from the one that Marshall had been part of when he first arrived in 1945. So it's this amazing period of change in international relations that affects the calculations of players on the ground very powerfully. The one thing that I found very funny to trace through the debates, they're trying to figure out what domino theory means. Domino theory had become very, very prevalent during the Cold War. During this period, they're just starting to work it out. And you see all these figures in Washington trying to come up with the right analogy to understand the threat from communism. One thing they use is a snowball. And they say there's a gigantic snowball of communism that's going to roll down the hill through Asia and take out China and then India and eventually make its way and take out the United States. There's another point where they use baseball analogies. And they say communism is going to reach first base in China, second base in India, third base in Africa, and then hit a home run when it gets to the United States. And you want to kind of shake them and say, dominoes is the analogy you're looking for, guys. This is domino theory where we have falling dominoes. But Chiang Kai-shek is seeing this and says, the thinking in Washington is really moving in my direction, and I can fight to the death. Now, skipping ahead a bit to the consequences, the third thing that I think is really striking in tracing this story from Marshall's perspective is just how much this experience, just how much the China mission would shape his own thinking about the Cold War world, but also U.S. foreign policy debates in the 1940s, but really through the course of the Cold War and in some ways through the present. So Marshall ends the China mission in January 1947 after being there 13 months, not 3, as Truman told him. Truman watches him in action here and asks him to become Secretary of State. And Marshall, again, doesn't really want to take on another job, but does not feel like he can say no. So he agrees to leave China and immediately go back to Washington and take on this big new job. And this is a place where again, the use of narrative was really useful to me in understanding what this looked like from Marshall's perspective. If you do this as a biographer, you look back on these as two separate periods of Marshall's career. There's the China mission period and the Secretary of State period. When you kind of trace that story through his eyes in these days, he leaves China on January 8th, 1947, having spent 13 months very, very intensively engaged in a set of Chinese problems that took 16 hours a day of his time through that 13-month period, and takes 1 week off and then goes to Washington and is immediately confronted with a whole world of incredible problems. There are Soviet threats that are popping up in the Middle East and Eastern Europe and Asia. There's an amazing amount of pressure in Washington to bring troops home. So the retrenchment pressures that people think about a lot today are very, very present in Washington in 1947. America's just fought this gigantic world war. 400,000 Americans have died, and people quite understandably say, we want our boys home. We don't want to be spending money on problems abroad. We think we should be able to focus on problems at home for a while. So Marshall sees this world of problems. He sees retrenchment pressures. and immediately has to reckon with the full scope of challenges that would come up in those first years of the Cold War. And what you see as you trace his thinking from the China mission to the Marshall Plan especially, which would come up a few months later, is that what he's trying to do in China in the second half of his mission to kind of put things back together and find a way forward for a stable China that can resist the pressures of communism is exactly what he ends up doing in Western Europe with the Marshall Plan. So he starts to talk about, when he's in China, the need for an American foreign policy that fundamentally addresses the everyday needs of people on the ground. And he starts to look at the ways that the problems of feeding a population and providing jobs for people and providing local governance and order are really fundamentally what this contest for power is about. And he again takes that from China to Western Europe and comes up with the Marshall Plan as the solution to that set of problems. The difference is that he sees partners on the ground in Western Europe that he thinks can make it work, and he does not in China. So the flip side of that ambition, he goes in and makes the case for Americans to spend what is equivalent to about $1 trillion as a percentage of GDP to help resurrect Western Europe. He thinks that's going to be a worthwhile investment and makes the case to Americans that they should make the sacrifices necessary to pay that cost. But he looks at China and says, I spent 13 months there trying to find a way to first broker a peace between these parties and then try to persuade the nationalist government to approach these questions differently so that they could sustain themselves in the face of a communist challenge. I don't think our partners on the ground are really going to be able to do what we need them to do to make our assistance worth it. So he says, we have limited resources. There's going to be a good investment we can make in Western Europe that will, in fact, stem the tide of communist power in Europe. I do not think we can make a similar investment in China that will work. And so in the second part of the 1940s, before Mao's victory in 1949, as there is a growing debate in Washington about what should be done about this problem, Marshall becomes a real skeptic of heavy-handed American intervention in China. You see a lot of proposals that feel like they could be coming up in the Vietnam debates of the early 1960s. We should put 10,000 advisors into combat with nationalist troops. We should put Douglas MacArthur in charge of the nationalist Chinese armies and let him take care of it. We should pour in economic aid. Marshall is one of the people who says, I think that none of those commitments are going to fundamentally change the dynamics of the Civil War in China. They're going to create huge risks for the United States, and they're going to take resources that we need elsewhere in the world and fritter them away in China where they're not going to make a difference. So Marshall ends up being a really central opponent of a major American intervention in China. He thinks it's going to be a slippery slope that's going to lead to a dangerous and likely futile war that could draw on the Soviets as well. And that brings us to the kind of third part of the significance for the Cold War, which is the who lost China debate. So the Chinese communists win in 1949, and immediately there's this kind of terrified reaction in the United States. And the question that is asked is, how did we lose this country that looked like it was going to become an ally, that looked like it was going to become this democratic power? There were these Christians who were in charge. Chiang Kai-shek had converted to Christianity, which had a lot of significance to people in the United States. The question that was asked was, how did Marshall and others around him screw this up? How do we lose this country? And that became one of the most powerful and poisonous questions in American politics in the 1950s. So McCarthyism really grows out of this experience of the quote-unquote loss of China. The most famous line from Joseph McCarthy is when he talks about a conspiracy so immense and infamy so black, the communist subversion of American foreign policy. Those words come in a speech on the floor of Congress about George Marshall. So McCarthy denounces this war hero, the man who had in many ways created the model of a modern American leadership in foreign policy. McCarthy denounces him as a traitor on the floor of Congress. And that is such a powerful message, such a powerful current in American politics in the 1950s that even when Marshall's protege, Dwight Eisenhower, is running for president, Eisenhower doesn't think he can defend Marshall against McCarthy. He goes to campaign in Wisconsin in 1952, and rather than standing up for Marshall, who has made his entire career as more responsible for making Dwight Eisenhower president than anyone else on earth, Eisenhower says, it's too costly for me to stand up to these attacks on him from McCarthy. So he ends up embracing McCarthy on stage and not doing anything to defend Marshall. Marshall, because this is the kind of guy he was, would say to Eisenhower, look, I don't hold it against you. Politics is a nasty business. You did what you had to do. But a lot of people would never forgive Eisenhower for what they saw as selling out Marshall. Truman would never look at Eisenhower with any admiration because of this moment of betrayal as he saw it. Even into the 1960s, this who lost China question really looms over foreign policy debate in Washington, especially in the run-up to Vietnam. And when you watch LBJ especially talking about the question of escalation in Vietnam, he refers back to this experience of the 1940s constantly. He says, I'm not sure that adding 200,000 troops to Vietnam is really going to make a difference, but we saw what happened to those guys who lost China. That's going to be chicken shit compared to what they do to us. A quote from LBJ, which is how he talks, of course. And LBJ said, I don't think I can accept defeat because the political costs are going to be so high. And that would be kind of this front of mind for policymakers through the 1960s. And even in the 70s and 80s, you see people in intervention debates referring back to the experience of, quote unquote, losing China as an argument for intervention. So it would become this frame that really shaped the way we thought about Cold War intervention. And in many ways, the problems that you see in these Cold War proxy battles very much echo some of the challenges that Marshall's struggling with on this mission. You see it as well today in Iraq and Afghanistan in the way we deal with partners on the ground. And so the kind of first experience of dealing with these proxy battles and trying to change the behavior of clients who at once rely on us, but also who we really desperately need to stay in power, that very, very thorny problem will kind of continue to bedevil foreign policy, I think, for a long time. A couple other lessons that I think grow out of this experience that are quite resonant in some of the debates we're having today. As I see it, so much the way we think about both American leadership in the world right now, but also about the U.S.-China relationship is based on myths, and myths of this period especially. And I believe we get a lot wrong because of the way we use those myths. With the U.S.-China relationship, we are at a moment, as Brad alluded to, I think kind of collective dismay about the failure of China to develop and the failure of the U.S.-China relationship to develop along the lines that people expected to from 1970s and the Nixon opening to China on. And in many ways, you see this cycle that Marshall lived through on this mission, where he starts with these hopes for China that Americans project onto Chinese realities, and then clings to those hopes really bitterly, even as the realities on the ground start to change. And then once those hopes fall apart, you see this kind of furor of recrimination and charges of betrayal that becomes a central factor in American politics and foreign policy going forward. That's the Who Lost China debate then. I think we're in a version of that now. And one of the lessons of this experience is that the damage that debate can do can be just as bad as the cost of those original false hopes. Secondly, as we enter what is called by the National Security Strategy and many others a new era of great power competition, people refer back to this period as a time when we faced another era of great power competition. And the mythology of this period is that Americans kind of stood strong and stepped forward and embraced global leadership and took on the burdens. We leave out the restraint part of that equation, which I think to Marshall is just as important. We could be ambitious in Western Europe because we were restrained in China. And you need to get both the restraint and the ambition right if you're going to compete effectively. And that, I think, is something that we lose quite a bit in debates today. So happy to talk about that contemporary stuff in Q&A, but let me leave it there on the book, and then happy to talk about both the book and foreign affairs issues more broadly in discussion.